There are some places that don't look like anything at all. A street you could walk down without noticing. A house that you might pass every day. Nothing about them stands out. Nothing about them warns you. And for a long time, nothing about them seems wrong. This is Hidden Chronicles. I'm Jenny. I love history and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. In this series, we explore crime through context rather than spectacle. I ask not just what happened, but what kind of world made it possible. This story begins in Gloucester, a city that lies in the southwest of England, a city that is working class in many areas. It is built on industry, routine, and familiarity. The kind of place where life follows a pattern. People know their surroundings. They know the streets they walk. They understand what feels normal. And within Gloucester, there is Cromwell Street, a residential street. Rows of terraced houses built close together. Front doors opening directly onto the pavement. Windows facing the same narrow stretch of road. The same view. Every day. The same routines, repeating over time. If you were to stand there, nothing would feel unusual. Nothing would suggest anything out of place. People leave for work in the morning, doors closing quietly behind them. The streets quiet. Later on, these people return. Conversations happen in passing. Light switches on behind curtains as the evening settles in. And life moves in a steady rhythm. Children grow up in those houses. They play. They learn. They watch. They begin to understand the world through what they see around them. What is repeated becomes familiar. And what is familiar becomes normal. And that matters, because what we recognise as normal is shaped by what we experience every day. It shapes what we question and what we don't. It shapes what stands out and what blends in. From the outside, Cromwell Street was ordinary. There was no reason to think otherwise. And that is where this story begins. Not with something dramatic. Not with something immediately recognisable, but with something that looked completely normal. Number 25 was just one house amongst many. A front door like the others. Windows like the others. Nothing about it that would immediately draw attention. And inside that house lived Fred and Rose West. They were a couple. They were married. And they had children. From the outside it appeared to be a family home. a place where everyday life was happening behind closed doors just as it was in every other house on the street. Fred West was born in 1941. He grew up in a rural environment in Gloucestershire. Accounts of his early life suggest a background that was complex, and at times deeply troubling. There are descriptions of blurred boundaries within the home and behaviours that, when viewed later, raised serious question. But at the time, much of this was not fully understood. It was not clearly recognised for what it might mean. Rosemary Letts was born in 1953. Her upbringing was unstable, marked by vulnerability, disruption, and a lack of consistent protection. Experiences that can shape how someone understands relationships, how they understand trust, what feels normal, even when it isn't. When Fred and Rose met, there was a clear difference between them. Fred was older, more experienced. Rose was still very young, at an age where her identity was still forming, where boundaries were still being understood, where influence matters more than it might later in life. And that imbalance is important because it shapes dynamics. It shapes control. It shapes who leads and who follows. It shapes what is questioned and what is accepted. From the outside, it may have appeared to be a relationship forming, a couple building a life together. But relationships are not defined by how they appear from a distance. They are defined by what happens within them. Over time, Fred and Rose built their life together. They married. They had children. And they settled into number 25 Cromwell Street. From the outside, they became part of the street. They were seen, recognised, known in the same way neighbours are known, not necessarily in detail, but in passing. Familiar faces, part of the environment. And like everything else around them, they appeared ordinary. But normality can be misleading, because what we see is not always what is there. And what happens behind closed doors is not always visible to the world outside them. Inside number 25, life was not as it appeared. Accounts that would later emerge described a household shaped by control, by tension, by an environment that did not feel entirely safe. But at the time, those details were not fully visible. They existed in fragments, in moments, in things that did not quite sit right, but were difficult to fully understand. And that is how patterns begin. Not always with something obvious, not always with something that can be clearly named, but with a series of moments that feel uncertain, that feel uncomfortable, that raise questions but not always clear answers. There is a tendency when looking back to ask how something like this could go unnoticed. To try and look for clear warning signs. To assume that something so serious must have been obvious. But reality is rarely that simple. What seems clear in hindsight is often far less clear in the moment. What appears obvious once the full picture is known is often made up of fragments when it is happening in real time. And in environments where everything appears normal, those fragments are easy to dismiss, easy to explain away, easy to overlook. That is what makes places like this significant. Not because they are visibly different, but because they are not. Because they do not stand out. Because they do not demand attention. Because they exist within the familiar. And that familiarity creates something powerful. It creates the assumption that everything is as it should be. That nothing is wrong, that there is no reason to look closer. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with what happened, but with the conditions that allowed it to happen. A place that felt ordinary, a family that appeared normal, an environment where nothing seemed out of place. And within that, something else was beginning to take shape. Next time we move closer to Fred and Rose themselves, to their relationship, to the dynamics between them, and to the early patterns that would begin to form behind closed doors. Thank you for listening. Until next time, please take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.